All right. Thanks for being here, or if you're watching this, thanks for watching it. This is what you always wanted to ask a PI but didn't know one to ask, where I'm going to answer questions that I find on Reddit or the internet, or if people join me for these events, I'm going to answer your questions. And with no attribution, you don't have to come on and say who you are, but when I go out in the internet, I see a lot of questions, I see a lot of things, a lot of people have questions and concerns and want to know about investigations as a career, or they want to know about investigations in general and how that could help them in their everyday life. So I'm going to take a few minutes and answer some of the questions that I found on Reddit. And one of them is, could a detective determine if an adult or elder abuse is occurring inside a home? And that is a real concern. I know a lot of my private investigations colleagues are involved in elder abuse investigations, but it's a tough question, right? Because who's hiring us to go look at the elder abuse, and where is that person? And if we're talking about inside a home, we're talking inside of their own home, or a place where they have some type of reasonable expectation of privacy, or their caretaker or whoever the suspect is may have a reasonable expectation of privacy. So those are tough. But what we're probably going to start with is we're going to identify who is involved in the situation, maybe even run some criminal background checks. If we can identify that somebody is a known perpetrator, perhaps, and maybe has a history of this, perhaps we can get law enforcement involved. There's all kinds of state agencies. Where I am in Arizona, there's an agency called APS, Adult Protective Services, and they specifically do these types of investigations. But many times those investigations don't rise to the level of having a law enforcement officer, government agent doing the investigation, so they'll come get us, or they'll reach out to an attorney, and the attorney will contract us. So some of the parts and pieces and things we want to be concerned with is, first of all, if we can determine quickly that the person, the elder, or sometimes even children are in true grave danger or harm, we need to remove them from that environment as quickly as possible. To do that, we're going to need a couple of things. We have to identify if that person is truly being abused. And I know this sounds a bit harsh, but sometimes people make things up. Sometimes people exaggerate things. So we need to independently verify if that is truly the case. If somebody's saying that person's being abused, great. How are they being abused? It may not just be physical. It may be emotional. It's harder to detect. It may even be financially, where somebody's coming into the home and they're stealing money from them, or they're extorting them, or they're getting them to sign away their will or their property or their money, things like that. So yes, a detective can determine to some extent if abuse is occurring when it's inside a home. Another thing that we can do, if let's say it's physical abuse, I've seen this, I haven't done this specifically, but you can put hidden cameras in certain parts of the house. What you have to be careful of when you're putting in hidden cameras is who owns the location that you're putting them in. So if a daughter is a caretaker of a spouse or a elder, and believes that a nurse who helps is abusing the elder when they're not around, and they control that environment, they own the environment, they have established that there's no expectation of privacy for the person that we suspect might be doing what they're doing. Sure, we can put a hidden camera in there, but we want to make sure that we're doing that legally and that we're talking with our attorney partners there. So that's one question there. Let's see what else. And there's a lot of people out there trying to obtain their private investigations license. One person here talks about trying to obtain their license in California. I am too, licensed investigator in the state of California, as well as the state of Arizona, although I primarily work out of Arizona. And what I can tell you is that, at least in California, you do have to have thousands and thousands of hours of experience, direct experience. Your experience as a police officer or a security guard is probably not enough to get you the prerequisite licensing hours. In California, not in Arizona, but in California, once you have those hours, and I want to say it's almost 2,500 or 3,000 hours, once you have that, then you have to, and it may even be more than that, then you have to sit for an exam, and then you have to pass that exam, and you pay a bunch of fees throughout your whole experience. And so if you're looking to apply for private investigator licensing because you want to be a PI, the best way to start, by the way, go find another PI to work with. Do investigative work like loss prevention for a retail establishment. That probably qualifies you to at least start getting your hours. By the way, when you get your hours, your employer has to attest to those hours. So I'm retired law enforcement. My agency, actually my former special agent in charge, has written a letter. He did one for California. He did one for Arizona when I got my Arizona license. And we submit that to the licensing board. Every state, almost every state, has its own licensing board that's responsible for those things. At least California and Arizona do. All right. Best camera to catch tenant drug dealing. What is the best camera to catch a tenant drug dealing? Okay, this goes back to what I was just saying about cameras in the home and you're trying to catch elder abuse. Do you have the right to monitor the area where you think this alleged drug dealing is going on? If so, then, and there's no expectation of privacy, then just about any camera. I'm a big fan of Ring. Ring doorbell camera captures audio and video pretty clearly, shoots quality video at night. That's always something you need to be concerned with. And many times people will buy kind of these cheaper cameras on Amazon, but when and if they say they have a night feature, at night, even ambient light can wash out night features or night video. So just be aware that you should probably spend a little bit of money if you want to catch somebody doing something that bad. And by the way, you should have cameras all around your property anyways. I don't know why you don't. Especially nowadays, it's cheaper. It's not cheap, it's cheaper than it used to be to have some type of video surveillance capability. All right. How to get in the field. We talked about that. Adoptions. Help us piece together our past. A lot of times, private investigators who are really good at research will be involved in helping identify birth parents or genealogy. When it comes to something like that, where there isn't necessarily a criminal nexus or a civil nexus, what I recommend is start talking to your local LDS or Mormon church. Most of them are really good at piecing together their past is required by their faith. They want to know their genealogy and how they're linked. Just find them on Facebook and connect with them. That's a great way to do it, and it's cheaper than having to hire a private investigator where we bill out at sometimes over $100 an hour depending on the engagement. Would a private investigator check in on a security guard service? I don't know what that means. Like do a background check? I guess probably that means background check. Missing person. There's lots of missing persons questions. Boy, family members go missing all the time. Looking into the death of a relative, that's tough. I've worked death investigations before. And your best witness sometimes is the one who's deceased, and putting those together so you at least have an understanding of what happened can be really difficult, especially if the person is what we call an unattended death. So they were by themselves, or somebody did not see how they succumbed to whatever it is that happened. This can happen with elderly people, children, things like that. Those are really tough. And a private investigator can only do so much. They can certainly go out there and knock on doors, do research, try and review video if there's video cameras in the area, things like that. Ultimately, though, if you have, and this is a little insensitive, but if you do have a body, you can have a forensic pathologist do what they do and review cause of death or mechanism of injury, mechanism of death, things like that. And those things can be very expensive as well. trying to determine cause of death is highly science-based. But that's why you want to hire a real expert to do that. This is a funny one. Okay, so it's because I have a funny story about this. Somebody on Reddit asks, Straw Cat Luffy asks, what are some ways to deal with extreme temperatures during surveillance? And Straw Cat's probably a private investigator of some sort when they're asking about this. Extreme temperatures. Everybody thinks about what happens when it gets cold in the surveillance van. And you have the vehicle on while you're on surveillance, while you're on the but I did the majority of my surveillance in hot weather environments where are certainly Phoenix and in Los Angeles. And when I was a federal agent, we injured two federal investigators while we were working on a kind of ridiculous case. We hurt these guys for no reason. And they were both sitting in the back of a van that we had to turn off. It was in Southern California, and it probably was in the summer, although that doesn't matter that much. And I do recall, I think it was in the summer, they had to be close to the location because we had done what's called a controlled delivery of some stuff and junk. I can't go into what it was or what we were doing or even where we were. But we needed to, for prosecution, we had to have somebody open the package. And to do that, we had a device that would alert us to the package being open. And I won't go into how that happens either. But when we did to do that, we had to be close enough to the location where the package was delivered so that we would get what's called the agent alert, and it was a tone that would come over a radio. And so you knew, okay, it's time to go in. And we sat on this thing for many, many days, but the temperatures were soaring. It was very hot. These two folks were sitting in the back of the surveillance van on what we call the eye, watching the target location. And they were sitting on a cooler, and I wasn't in the van with them, but they've described this to me in great detail, so I'll share it with you. They're sitting on the cooler in the back of this van, watching out the back windows, and throughout the surveillance, these two, hardcore federal investigators, special agents, ended up. It was so hot they had taken off all their raid jackets and equipment, and were dumping water on their head to cool themselves down. That's how hot it got. We eventually did what we call pushing them from the eye. We pushed them off the eye, which meant that they got in their vehicle and drove away. We brought in another surveillance vehicle to stay on the eye, so we didn't miss anything. And when we pushed them to the eye, from the eye, we actually had them drive to, because they had said that it's getting hot. We need to bounce. And they had been there for many, many hours, and maybe even as long as 4 to 6 hours, which is not ideal, especially when it's hot, because they can't have the vehicle on, right? Because the vehicle on, sitting there, where you can't see anybody behind the wheel, is suspicious. People call the police. Well, in good neighborhoods, people call the police. In bad neighborhoods, they know that you are the police, and they don't engage with you. So they pushed and went to the local police station where they were met. Fortunately, we had a tactical medic on our team. It was a great task force I was on. And the TAC medic, and some of you, if you're watching this, you know the story. Don't reveal who was involved. But these guys were in a bad way. Thank God we had a good SWAT medic, and he got them both on an IV Ricky Tick, and they survived. But they were like throwing up in the bathroom. It was really a bad scene. So what are some ways that you can deal with extreme temperatures during surveillance? So it depends, hot or cold. I think, and y'all from like Alaska and Nebraska will differ on opinion, but I think you can always stay warmer than you can to cool down. Sometimes you just can't remove yourself from the heat. When it's 120 out here in Phoenix, we get it very hot. In your car, it's going to be like 150. So how do you stay cool? Well, this is where being creative comes in. If you can have a battery-operated vehicle that can stay on without making that engine running noise, that's ideal. But that's not always possible. Battery electric vehicles, when their heat exchange or heat pump turns on, it makes a sound. And that attracts attention. It doesn't look like just a vehicle sitting there on the side of the road or on. So you have to be careful. A lot of folks that I am connected with, when they do surveillance, they actually will put a camera out there. I won't say how they do it, but they'll actually put what in federal law enforcement we call a pole cam, but they'll in place some type of surveillance camera on the target location or on the eye, so that they don't have to be sitting in extreme temperatures because it's not safe. You could die, and so I don't recommend it. But I had a funny story, so I figured I'd talk about that. A lot of missing person requests. What do you do? What happens if you need to find somebody? So a lot of surveillance questions. I don't really see a lot of people doing surveillance anymore. I see a lot of people in placing remote cameras, and I totally recommend that. GPS trackers too. It's tricky. What I say is if you want to track a vehicle, you better in place that tracker where you have the ability to do it safely, and the safety being number one. You don't want to get caught underneath somebody's car. Having been there and done that with the federal government, that's never fun. It's always awkward. But when you're doing this as a private investigator, you need to be really careful. And I recommend that you work with your law firm or your legal partner to understand where and when and how you can do that safely, so you don't violate, again, somebody's rights and their expectations of privacy. Because if they drive into a location where they have an expectation of privacy and you're monitoring that, it could be you put yourself in legal hot water. So I don't necessarily recommend doing that, although trackers are way better than actually trying to physically follow somebody. We were following a guy when I was a federal agent, following a guy around, and he was doing what we call a heat run, or if you've worked for the intelligence community, you call it a surveillance detection route. And you probably have heard, James Bond movies talk about this, but he was doing a heat run, basically looking for a tail. And we were all, trying to be very aggressive and follow him and not lose the eye. And then our supervisor was yelling at us on the radio, "Hey guys, back off. We've got a tracker in how we had a tracker." Let's play with that. We had a tracker. So there's no reason to follow this guy around. Anyways, so, or chase him, as it were. Let him go do his heat runs. We've got a tracker. No big deal. We ended up catching him, and I think when we engaged him, he pooped himself, which maybe that's for another event. Next Friday. Follow me next Friday, and we'll talk about that. All right. Advantages of being a PI versus a police officer or police detective. That's a really interesting question. If you follow me on YouTube or on LinkedIn, I post a lot about helping law enforcement transition to the private sector. And I've talked with folks who have been both police officers and now PIs. Steve Mason, great Arizona private investigator, has been on my show and has talked about, he was a U.S. Marshal and now he's a private investigator and what the advantages were to him. I think the number one, I'll just list a couple, but I think the number one advantage, having been a law enforcement officer, is that I can take the cases that I want to take, and I have a lot more freedom to do that, and a lot more creativity on how it gets done. And whereas as a federal agent or in federal law enforcement, I didn't. I was usually assigned, you're in the queue, and here's your next case. You don't get any choice on who you work with, who the victims are, who the subjects are, and sometimes even who the prosecutor is. So that's my feeling is that this is the private investigation side. I get to choose kind of who I want to work with and the kind of things that I want to work on. And they're usually things that I'm passionate about, like social media investigations, things like that. All right. Oh, and you don't necessarily have that as a police officer. One advantage, by the way, for law enforcement is they generally have way more authority to do things. That is not that big a deal for me because authority-wise, I've worked investigations all around the world for the military. I was a criminal investigator in the Air Force. And we would go into countries sometimes where we had very limited powers or authority because of what they call a SOFA, a Status of Forces Agreement. So when I worked in Europe, we would have to do things a certain way depending on who we were working with. And so I'm used to kind of not having all the authority and jurisdiction to go there and do things. That's definitely something I will say a police officer has that's very clear. So, all right. A lot of people trying to look for their family. People looking for information like social security numbers on others. One thing I do want to say about that is can a private investigator find things like social security numbers? Of course, that's actually really easy. But we need to know why you need that information. So sometimes we'll be hired by businesses to do what's called skip tracing, where we can find out, where is somebody, laying their head, bedding down, um, and we'll be able to obtain certain private information that the general public can't and shouldn't. Are there ways that the public can obtain personal information? Sure. But you also could be charged with identity theft. So be very careful with what you're doing and how you're doing it and why you're doing it. So we will ask you in my contract that I have my clients sign. I actually have an attestation that you're not a stalker. You're not trying to find somebody. Now I don't do too many. I don't have clients who are generally not lawyers. I work with mostly law firms as a private investigator. A person asking about acquiring experience. How do I acquire experience? Well, first of all, you got to know the jurisdiction where you want to work. Do you need experience? There are certain states, I don't know them all, but there are certain states that have more experience requirements than others. And it depends on the type of experience, right? So go to figure out what state you're in. Hopefully you know that. Then you go to the licensing body. In the state of California, it's called the Bureau of Security and Investigative Services. It's under the Department of Labor, I think. Here in Arizona, the department, essentially their highway patrol, DPS, Department of Public Safety, licenses security and investigators. So there's a website for it. You go to the website, you read about, hey, these are the things that I need to do, and this is how I can what kind of experience they require. Because again, like I said, it's not always, I was a security guard for 5 years, I'm good, right? Maybe not. You got to really read there. And they'll tell you, they'll be very specific. And if it's not, just email them, call them, reach out to them. They're public servants. They should be answering your questions. Somebody asked, so what are the best background check services? That's a great question because I'm kind of a background check nerd because I don't even call it background checks. I call them due diligence. I want to know, about, is this person going to be good for my company? Is this vendor somebody I want to work with? Is this new business partner somebody I want to work with? And I get those questions all the time. And so to understand that, we need to do a lot of what I call due diligence, and we need to do a lot of digging. We need to really try to understand this person holistically. Some people will pretend to be something that they're not. They'll pretend to have experience that they don't have. And so how do you get past that? You've got to dig. And I go into things more deeply than a lot of kind of my competitors will. I don't just look at criminal history or where they worked last. I want to go all the way back as far as I can. Now, sometimes you're legally restricted from going too far back. And you're legally restricted from pulling information like credit data to hire somebody or make a hiring determination on them. So knowing first what the rules of that background game are, you've got to be aware of that and what you're going to use that information for. And I try to use background services that are very broad. I want to look at your social media. I want to look at your civil, criminal histories. I want to look at everything. And depending on the client and what the client is looking for, I may want to understand how you fit into this puzzle internationally. I might want to look at sanctioned parties lists. to see if you've been sanctioned from doing business in some place like France or South Africa or something. Every country around the world has some type of sanctioned party list. So anyways, being very diligent, and it's not as easy as just going to one, I click on this link and I go in there and put the information, their name, their date of birth, and I'm going to find everything. Many government jurisdictions do not report into private databases, so you just got to be aware of that, especially when you're asking for those kinds of services. Finding out more about a business, like I was saying, I look at businesses and I look at people very much the same way. With a business, though, I want to make sure you're licensed. If you need to be bonded or insured, can I verify those things independently? Those things need to be verified as much as possible independently. What that means is, did a business send us some type of verification that they have insurance, let's say? Okay, great, but I want to go now contact that insurer or the company that's providing a bond, let's say, and I want to independently verify that. I want to ensure that that person is who they say they are, and that entity is insured for what they say they're insured for example. So like I said, it's one thing to check their license status. You can do that, but do you know who else they're doing business with? Do you know who the owners of that business are? And by the way, many companies are required by international law to know those things, but they don't. You've got to know who your vendors are. Very similar to a number of years ago, you may recall, Nike and Apple were getting in trouble in China because they had child labor going on at their factories. Now, when we say their factories, is that an Apple factory? It's probably not owned by Apple. It's probably owned by another company who manufactures for them. They sub to a manufacturer. The manufacturer makes their stuff. And they never checked. They had no idea that they were employing children to make Nikes or to make iPhones. So there's a lot of requirements if you do business internationally to know who your vendors are, your manufacturers, your transportation. Are they committing crimes on your behalf to make your goods or to get your goods to market? So you got to know those things. Okay, I'll do a couple more and then we'll call it. Can I get a PI to help with determining income of an individual? Again, I'm going to ask, why do you want to know what somebody's income is? Usually when we get those questions, it's family related or spousal related, where the spouse is trying to understand what assets the other spouse has. And so what we do is called an asset search. So we can find information, and it will always, in my case, be legally found and reproducible, because I do everything in anticipation of litigation. I anticipate that we're going to go to trial or go to court, or my records or my report rather, and maybe even myself to testify will be in front of a judge or a jury, and or some type of legal proceeding. So I will do everything legally, and if I can't get something, I will tell you I can't get something. And usually I know beforehand if we can try and get something. Okay. Trying to find out who owns a business. That's easy. Package pretexting. I'll just talk about pretexting because I think I know what they're talking about. Okay, so pretexting may be legal in the jurisdiction where you are, and it may not be legal. If a private investigator is having, let's say, a victim reach out to a subject and say, why did you do this horrible thing to me? And try to get a confession on a phone call that would be recorded on one side or the other. I think you just need to be careful. I think you need to reach out to your legal partners. And again, doing those things with a lawyer who understands that area of law is really important, because again, and anytime, I'm just really concerned, anytime we start talking about uh, going to where people believe they have privacy, so private communications, private areas of their life or of their property. So that's that's. And I'll give you one more. How do you protect yourself from a private investigator? I don't know what a private investigator is doing to you that you would need to protect yourself. But the question, if I read into it a little bit more, is probably about stalking. I have they have a coworker or somebody or an ex-boyfriend that's hired a private investigator, and that now they're stalking them. This is why we as a private investigations industry really need to be sure who our clients are. We don't always get to pick who our clients are going to be and if they're going to tell us the truth. It's just reality. So what I recommend is that if somebody had come to me and said, "Hey, I think this private investigator is stalking me," I would notify law enforcement, first of all, because stalking is a crime. So, but it has certain things that it has to meet. There are certain things that somebody has to do to meet that threshold. If they're just sitting out in front of your house with a video camera, is that really stalking? I mean, TMZ does that all the time in LA, so they don't get arrested for it. So, notify your law enforcement. Notify law enforcement if you think you're being stalked. That's kind of thing one, because it may not be a private investigator. Hopefully, if a private investigator is doing it, you never know that they're there. This is probably bad tradecraft. Anyways, if you find out or you figure out that they're a private investigator, you think they're stalking you, that you think they might be committing a crime, obviously notifying law enforcement. You can also notify their licensing board. And if you know who it is, go tell them who that private investigator is and that they might be violating the rules of ethics. All of us sign the rules of ethics if we're licensed in a state. That's one of the big reasons why you should hire only licensed private investigators. And with that, I will leave you till next Friday. We'll do this again, and I'll come on and we'll answer some questions if you have them. If not, I'll go to Reddit and we'll talk there. But I want you to be safe out there. If you have questions, feel free to contact me. My information will be in wherever I'm posting this. And you can always reach out to me. I don't mind doing consultation calls for free. I'm happy to give you a few minutes of my time so that you can understand how to be safer in the world and go out there and do your best work. That's what I want you to do. All right, till next time, have a great weekend.